When you think of a natural disaster associated with California, most of us think of what? Earthquakes, right? For the most part, we think of earthquakes, mudslides, and wildfires. Well, while true, it's not the only potential catastrophe that Mother Nature has up her sleeve. RT correspondent Natasha Sweet with more now from our West Coast newsroom.
When we hear a reference to a volcano, especially on the West Coast, most of us would naturally assume Hawaii. But actually, some 200,000 people live, work, or even pass through California's volcanic hazard zones every day. A study conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey reveals that at least 10 eruptions in the past 1,000 years happened in Northern California's Lassen Peak from 1914 to 1917. And the peak is only one of 8 volcanic areas in the state that could potentially erupt. The main concern out of the study was the high population surrounding the volcanoes. In fact, Mount Shasta has nearly 104,000 people in its vicinity, and the 4 volcanoes in the Long Valley region have 63,500 people. And thousands more live in other areas which could pose risks, not to mention the volcanoes near national parks and their millions of annual visitors. And the USGS says anywhere from 500 to 1,000 passenger jets fly over the California volcanoes every day. Now, this study is eye-opening, revealing that schools, police stations, fire stations, and medical facilities are all in these volcanic hazard zones. And more than 2,800 miles of roads would also be in the line of fire.
One of the judgments described in the book of Revelation seems to include a massive volcanic eruption, as we read in Revelation 8:8. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood. Welcome to the Watchman YouTube channel. This channel is all about world news and Bible prophecy, pointing to the soon return of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Jesus said, as a sign of his coming and the end of the age, there would be an increase in deception, false Christs who will deceive many, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, Christian persecution, apostasy, false prophets, and lawlessness, causing the love of many to grow cold. Jesus said all of these signs would come like birth pains. Jesus was likening last days events to a woman in labor. As the labor progresses, the pains increase in both frequency and intensity until the baby finally comes. As we get closer to Jesus' return, all the signs he gave us as a sign of his coming and the end of the age will become more frequent and more intense. All of these signs are manifesting around the world in our time.
U.S.-backed Kurdish-led forces poured into the last ISIS stronghold for a final assault tonight to defeat the Islamic State. They rained mortars on ISIS's only remaining territory. The Syrian village of Baghouz is now in ruins. So is the ISIS dream of a caliphate. One of the top Kurdish commanders took us to the front lines here.
You can hear the coalition aircraft above,
staying in a single file to avoid stepping on ISIS mines.
He's saying that all of the houses around here have been booby-trapped, have been set up with mines. Only a few places that they have cleared are safe to go into. And this is one of them.
Inside, we headed for the roof.
This was an old ISIS field clinic. Now, the Kurdish-led forces have taken it over, and it's their most advanced position.
The commander showed me how ISIS is completely surrounded. They say the final push will be over soon. The assault had been delayed while the Kurdish-led forces allowed the wives and children of ISIS fighters to leave. 15,000 did. These tonight were the last to leave, escaping the Islamic State before it's wiped out completely.
Kurdish commanders here tell us the remaining ISIS fighters are dug in tunnels, but that they should be able to root them out within 2 days.
It hasn't been an easy fight. ISIL is making its last stand in its last pocket of territory in Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces launched a final assault on Baghouz on Friday, but the offensive has since slowed down. The Kurdish-dominated force blames the armed group of continuing to use civilians as human shields.
We are taking into consideration the possible presence of civilians who are with the terrorists and are being used as human shields, or even families of ISIL fighters who decided to stay with the terrorists. Our forces are on the battlefield and they notice the presence of civilians. That is why they are taking necessary measures.
It's not clear how many people remain inside the tiny enclave, but last week thousands were transported out of Bahrouz, mainly women and children, families of ISIL fighters. The exodus worsened what was already a humanitarian emergency. The new arrivals, weak, hungry and tired, were brought to an overcrowded camp. The population of El Hol in northeast Syria is now over 55,000. Aid agencies are overwhelmed.
There are still so many new arrivals coming in, and the aid agencies are doing the best they can, but we weren't prepared for the number that are arriving, so we're struggling with having enough tents. We have found more than 40 children that have been separated from their parents during the journey, so have been able to reunify several of them, but the needs are immense.
81 deaths have been registered, many from hypothermia, almost two-thirds of them infants. Some died on the way to the camp, others shortly after reaching it.
4 years ago, ISIL controlled 88,000 square kilometers of territory from Syria to Iraq and ruled over 8 million people. But it was in 2017 when the armed group began to lose major cities in both countries in separate offensives by different players.
The latest battle against ISIL was launched by the US-backed SDF in September, and the target was its strongholds in the Euphrates Valley. Many ISIL fighters have surrendered, many of them foreigners. An unknown number are still inside Bahrouz. The US-led coalition says many are hiding in tunnels. Losing Bahrouz would be a symbolic blow to the armed group, but it will continue to be a security threat. Many fighters have slipped into Iraq, and others are in the desert in eastern Syria.
Much of what we know about North Korea's nuclear arsenal comes from what Pyongyang itself releases. These pictures, made available in the final months of U.S. President Barack Obama's administration, provided startling images of potential progress. Foreign intelligence agencies scrutinized these photographs in detail to try and determine if this device was actually an atomic bomb. In September 2016, North Korea conducted its fifth nuclear test and announced it had standardized the production of nuclear warheads.
The North has long maintained that its nuclear arsenal is necessary to deter an invasion by U.S. troops. And even if the props aren't real, U.S. intelligence officials would conclude 6 months into the Trump administration that North Korea had successfully miniaturized an atomic weapon like this, small enough to fit on a missile. And after successfully test-firing intercontinental ballistic missiles, new UN sanctions were imposed. And the U.S. president warned of
fire, fury, and frankly, power like the world has never seen.
That's if Pyongyang didn't stop making threats. Well, North Korea responded by unveiling plans to fire missiles near the U.S. Pacific Island territory of Guam and its military bases.
Then, in September 2017, photographs were released that set more alarm bells ringing in Washington. Kim Jong-un inspecting what appears to be a hydrogen bomb, small enough to fit on an intercontinental ballistic missile. Later that day,
a seismic event, possibly two, in North Korea that South Korea says was man-made.
A sixth nuclear test, its largest to date. It created tremors that were felt in China and Russia.
Analysts have their doubts about the claims made by Pyongyang because they can't be independently verified. But these images have always sent signals to foreign adversaries and researchers who use them to make models like these, created by the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for the Nuclear Threat Initiative to estimate size, weights, and explosive energy of these devices.
From ground imagery, we can extrapolate certain dimensions from missiles and design concepts from their nuclear weapons that they display. And we can try to understand better what the projections of their missile ranges are and what type of designs that they are going for.
6 weapons have already been used in tests, but what about the others? Well, South Korea thinks the North may have up to 60, with this kind of thermonuclear bomb being the most powerful. And while there hasn't been another test in more than a year, and North Korea is talking to the United States, Korea watchers believe the North has continued producing plutonium and highly enriched uranium. along with ballistic missiles. Enough perhaps for several more weapons able to be attached to rockets capable of reaching much of the world. So many believe that it's probably a good thing these two are at least talking, although cynics say it may well turn out to be little more than another photo opportunity.
In the last days, the Bible tells us that Jerusalem will be a cup of drunkenness to the surrounding nations, as we read in Zechariah 12:2. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. The idea of a cup of drunkenness is to cause the neighboring nations to reel, to go mad, and to lose the capacity for sound reasoning, leading those nations to judgment. This prophecy is unfolding right before our very eyes.
Israeli jets struck multiple Hamas military targets in Gaza overnight Sunday in response to yet another incendiary balloon carrying explosives being sent from the Strip. And thankfully, no injuries or damages were reported, but as always, Israel holds Hamas responsible for any attack from Gaza, especially as this latest balloon follows an incident just last Wednesday where a civilian home in the Eshkol region was damaged by a floating explosive device that detonated in the air outside. And since the March of Return riots began nearly a year ago this month, thousands of balloons have been sent over, causing at least 2,000 separate fires and damages to at least 8,500 acres of nature reserves, forests, and agriculture. Additionally, and in that same time period, at least 1,300 rockets have been fired from the Strip at southern Israeli Gaza border communities, and again, typically over the weekend during these same March of Return riots. In fact, just this weekend, the IDF reported roughly 8,000 Palestinians riding along the Gaza-Israel border while throwing stones, grenades, and other explosives at IDF forces under the cover of tire fires that they had also set. And the IDF responded with crowd dispersal methods and some live fire. Palestinian health officials reported at least 20 injuries, with 3 of them, supposedly including a medic and a journalist, being serious. Meanwhile, the IDF also reported that over the weekend they made at least 9 arrests of Palestinian suspects thought to be involved in violence and terror-related activities against civilians and the Air Force, and the suspects have all since been transferred for questioning. This, just as homemade pipe bombs and Molotov cocktails were also thrown at Route 60 from the village of El Khader near Bethlehem, though there were no casualties or damages reported there, and an investigation has been opened.
God gives a dire warning for the nations that come against Jerusalem, as we read in Zechariah 12:3. And it shall happen in that day, that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it.
On another note, a new report by NZIV.net is now alleging that Hezbollah and Iranian forces in Syria are amassing along the Israeli border in the northern Golan Heights, and the units are allegedly being used to gather actionable tactical information. Further, as the report explains, 3 major units have been created. The first is comprised of Hezbollah fighters who were active in Syria during the civil war, and apparently, rather than letting them return home to Lebanon now that the fighting is over, they were positioned on the Israeli-Syrian border by Iran as Iranian Commander Soleimani's eyes and ears. Then the second unit is formed from a mix of forces from Hezbollah, the Iraqi Al-Hashd al-Sha'abi organization, Afghanistan, and Syrian villages, and this unit was stationed in the Jezreel Valley. Finally, the third group is another unit of Iranian and Hezbollah forces, whom were also placed in the Jezreel Valley, but their primary mission is to recapture the Golan Heights from Israel. And all of this comes just after Syrian President Assad reportedly sent reinforcements to the Golan border earlier this month as well. It also comes a week after the UK added Hezbollah's political wing to the list of recognized terror organizations, a move that Iran called wrong and irresponsible, though the UK explained that it was, quote, no longer able to distinguish between Hezbollah's already banned military wing and the political party, end quote. And now, being a member or activist of Hezbollah in the UK is a criminal offense, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. In other news, the Syrian Sana news agency reported that IDF forces struck targets in the Druze town of Khader Sunday night in the southern Syrian province of Quneitra, just 3 kilometers away from the border in the Golan. And the reports went on to claim that the target was a deserted area, causing no damages or casualties. But while Israel has not confirmed this attack, this incident comes just after Syrian, Iraqi, Hezbollah, and Iranian forces, among others, were reported to be grouping along the Israeli-Syrian border. And this also follows similar attacks in the Quneitra area that the IDF has admitted to, which fall in line with stated Israeli policy in Syria, that no enemy forces will be tolerated encroaching on the Israeli border, least of all Iran and Iranian proxies like the Lebanese Hezbollah, which has recently redefined in its entirety as a terror organization by the UK. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu again alluded to this policy at the weekly cabinet meeting on Sunday when he spoke of his recent discussions with Russian President Putin, saying that he had made it, quote, unequivocally clear that Israel will not allow the military entrenchment of Iran in Syria, end quote, and that Israel would continue to take military action. To that effect, Netanyahu added that the two had agreed to continue security coordinations between the Russian military and the IDF in Syria as well.
The Bible tells us there are 4 possible prophecies on the verge of finding fulfillment. Isaiah 17:1, in which Damascus, Syria will be destroyed in a single night. Jeremiah 49, the prophecy of Elam, which could infer an Israeli attack upon Iran's nuclear program. Psalm 83, in which the Muslim nations that border Israel will mount an attack on Israel in order to cut them off from being a nation. Ezekiel 38 and 39, known as the War of Gog and Magog. In this prophecy, a coalition of nations led by Russia, Iran, and Turkey will attack Israel in the last days in order to take Israel's wealth.
Good evening, I'm Jeff Glor reporting tonight from Beauregard, Alabama. Where I'm standing, there was a home yesterday. It is gone. The foundation lines are all that remains here. Here is a view from above in Alabama. Destruction as far as we can see from here. A few homes still left standing in this area along Route 38, but those are the exceptions, not the rule. The scar across Lee County is nearly a mile wide and at least 24 miles long. The tornado's estimated strength was upgraded today to EF4 with winds of up to 170 miles an hour. At least 23 people were killed here, including 3 children. It is the worst tornado outbreak in the United States in nearly 6 years. And more than 24 hours later, many are still unaccounted for.
Oh, dude, that's a big tornado.
The catastrophic winds tore through entire blocks of Lee County, Alabama.
Oh my God.
At speeds as high as 170 miles an hour. Drone footage revealed flattened forests, tangled with homes, cars, and power lines. Sirens gave this community of 10,000 an 8 to 10 minute warning to seek shelter. Insulation from destroyed homes clung eerily to tree after tree.
All right, so right now we're going with the sheriff to some of the worst hit areas after this tornado. It's clear that officials here in Alabama are still trying to determine the full scope of all the damage here.
Jay Jones has been the sheriff of Lee County for more than 20 years.
When I look out here, it looks like war. Yeah, it's not just tree snap, but you can see pulled up by the roots, literally the trees pulled all the way out of the ground.
In Beauregard, Alabama, the storm tore this cell tower from its base, making communication difficult. Nearby, the roof was ripped from this bar, exposing everything inside. Owner David McBride sat in his truck only a few feet away as the tornado left his livelihood in ruins.
I seen the trash swirling in the air across the hill over there, and I said, oh no, this ain't good.
Alabama's Governor Kay Ivey described the sobering reality in Lee County.
We lost children, mothers, fathers, neighbors, and friends.
Among that growing list of victims, a 10, 9, and 6-year-old. Those who survived called family and gave thanks.
I thank the Lord.
Still sitting on foundations where nothing is left standing. The storm left a string of destruction throughout the South, in Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida as well. As rescue crews searched through debris back in Lee County, Joseph Vernon learned he lost more than just his home.
Lost a real good friend of mine next door.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, you know, day by day, that's all you can do.
The emotional toll here, Mark, is staggering.
Yeah, you talk to these people, they all have their own story of heartbreak. I spoke with one woman who has lived here in Beauregard all of her life, and she just has no idea how she's going to recover from this.
Oh my God. All this right here was wooded.
Shannon Kelly's neighborhood was the killer tornado's bullseye and is now unrecognizable.
Oh, dude, that's a big tornado.
No one was home when the tornado struck. She was about to see for the first time what remained of her home for the last 20 years.
Everything is gone. Complete disaster.
I was shaking and yeah, like I'm still shaking.
Yeah. Shaken by what she saw, along with her son Alex and her best friend, Tanya Banks.
I seen a frame, I seen a piece of a wall, but like I didn't see a trailer. I just want to know where. I mean, nobody could tell me where my trailer went.
And when you look at destruction like that and think about rebuilding, where do you start?
I didn't have insurance. I don't have a clue where to start at. Like, I don't even know. Like, where do you go? Like, all you can do is go up from here, but where do you start at?
In this neighborhood, people have always looked after one another. But like Shannon, most of them now have nothing.
Is there a silver lining in this?
Yeah, my family's okay. Exactly.
All 23 people who were killed died within 1 square mile of each other. And Jeff, Shannon told me she has no idea how many of those victims were her neighbors or her friends.
When a tornado hits, sometimes inches can make all the difference. Here's Omar Villafranca.
When you guys came back in here, this is what you saw.
Yes, this is what we came to.
Kim Serta is lucky, despite the fact Mother Nature punched several holes in her house.
Everywhere you look, there's a tree somewhere in or on my house.
She survived by clinging to a shoe rack in her bedroom closet.
When I was being sucked up, I was on the phone with my mother, and I kept telling her, I'm gone, I'm gone, I'm gone, because I thought I was fixing to go through my roof.
It was lifting you up.
I was this high off the ground.
Luck was on 69-year-old Sam Cook's side, too.
By the time I got here, all this was down.
He went to check on his 90-year-old mother-in-law and came within inches of death when this giant tree limb crashed on top of his truck just as he got out.
I mean, this would have killed you, Sam.
I dug down, and I could feel these things here when I went through.
And so you had to push your way through.
Push my way through.
I've never seen this level of devastation.
Smith Station's Mayor Bubba Copeland turned into a first responder last night, pulling 2 women out of a collapsed house.
How did you guys not have any fatalities?
It's a miracle. It's really a miracle.
A huge miracle for the folks in this small town, now picking up the pieces and counting their blessings.
One of the most well-known verses of Scripture showing that God controls the weather is found in Matthew 8:23 through 27. Now when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him, and suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. But he said to them, Why are you fearful, O you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him? We are currently living in a time Jesus refers to as the birth pains. We are fast approaching a time known as the tribulation, that Jesus says will be the worst time in human history, as we read in Matthew 24:21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. We are currently witnessing events that will continue to become more frequent and more intense until God pours out his final judgments on an unbelieving and unrepentant world. The world is witnessing unprecedented extreme weather that will carry over into the tribulation period, and the news headlines prove it.
The Afghan military flying over flooded Kandahar province on a mission to rescue 1,000 people trapped by floods. There's been heavy rain in Afghanistan and southern Pakistan for more than a week. On Saturday, flash floods swept through towns and villages across the region.
A disaster took place in Kandahar. There's no drainage and there is little public awareness, which is why so many people were affected. Most of the affected people were already internally displaced and living on the riverbanks, so they were hit harder than the others.
The traditional homes, constructed from mud and clay, stood little chance as the floodwaters surged through.
I'm a poor man. The walls of my house have been damaged. My 2 children were injured. I'm asking the government to help me by providing tents.
Now we're distributing emergency aid. On the advice of the governor, we made a list of 397 families. Of that, 250 families had their homes fully destroyed.
The UN is sending teams and setting up shelters to help the displaced.
I think another issue that we're dealing with is accessibility. In some of the more rural areas that we're only just getting to, people are quite cut off, they are quite vulnerable, so obviously an event like this has a bigger impact on them.
The destruction extends from Kandahar through 6 different provinces to Herat and Farah in the west. More than 500 homes have been damaged or destroyed, as well as schools, mosques and bridges. In Pakistan, the southern province of Baluchistan has been hardest hit. The military rescued hundreds of families stranded by floodwaters. Relief camps have been set up for those at higher altitudes